West Sussex, England, at the start of the new millennium. Charlie Burrell sat quietly across the table from his accountant, listening to the kind of conversation every struggling landowner fears. The numbers were undeniable. The farm was bleeding money, and it had been that way for years. For nearly 2 decades, they had fought to make the 3,500-acre Knepp estate profitable, but the land simply refused to cooperate. The dense clay soil was waterlogged, compacted, and worn out after generations of intensive farming. No matter how much effort went into the operation, the harvests never delivered the kind of returns a traditional English farm needed to survive. The accountant made the reality painfully clear. Either they changed course completely, or the estate would eventually collapse under the financial pressure. Charlie and his wife, Isabella Tree, were suddenly facing a decision that most farmers would never even entertain. They could continue down the same road, losing money year after year while gradually selling off pieces of the estate just to keep going. They could stop forcing the land to behave like farmland, not abandon it entirely, but step back and allow nature reclaim control. Their idea was to reintroduce animals, not carefully managed livestock standing in tidy fenced pastures, but creatures that could roam freely across the landscape the way their ancient ancestors once had, long before modern agriculture transformed England into endless stretches of monoculture. One of the first animals they released onto the estate was a small group of Exmoor ponies. But over the next 20 years, the impact those ponies had on the vegetation and the ecosystem became so dramatic that even ecologists struggled to fully explain what they were witnessing. If you really want to see what English land is capable of when humans stop controlling every inch of it, keep watching, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Before diving into what happened next, it's important to understand what the Knepp estate actually looked like around the year 2000 and why the land had ended up in such rough condition. For thousands of years, the lowlands of southern England were never meant to be the neatly divided farmland people recognize today. Originally, this landscape was a wild and constantly evolving mix of woodland pasture, tangled thorn scrub, open meadows, ancient trees, and marshy wetlands. It was messy, dynamic, and always changing. What kept that ancient environment alive were large, roaming animals that had shaped the region since long before the last ice age. The massive wild ancestors of modern cattle grazed across open areas and prevented the land from becoming overgrown. Wild boar rooted through the soil with their snouts, constantly disturbing the ground and creating opportunities for new plants to grow. Meanwhile, tarpons, the extinct wild horses of Europe, fed on rough grasses that other animals ignored. Together, these animals continuously reshaped the environment. Modern ecologists describe this kind of system as a mosaic landscape, a patchwork of habitats, all existing at different stages of development. Some areas would become dense scrub, others open grassland, while nearby sections turned into woodland or wetland. But over time, those large animals vanished. Some were hunted into extinction, while others disappeared as expanding agriculture slowly erased the old wilderness. Eventually, nearly every accessible part of the English countryside was converted into farmland. By the end of the 20th century, the Sussex landscape surrounding Knepp had become a tightly organized agricultural system. Huge stretches of winter wheat and maize covered the land in orderly, uniform blocks. Everything looked efficient and controlled, but biologically, it had become incredibly simplified. At Knepp itself, the situation had become especially severe after decades of intensive farming practices. Heavy machinery repeatedly compressed the clay soil until rainwater could barely soak into the ground anymore. Old Victorian drainage channels had also transformed the estate's natural water system. Instead of allowing rivers and wetlands to move slowly across the landscape, engineers had straightened and deepened the channels to force water off the land as quickly as possible. The result was a system of fast-moving ditches that rapidly drained the ground dry between periods of rainfall. The wildlife that once defined the English countryside had almost completely disappeared. Nightingales were absent. Turtle doves had vanished. Purple emperor butterflies were nowhere to be found. Out of Britain's 18 native bat species, 13 had disappeared from the estate entirely. Hedgehogs were gone too. Even the wildflowers that should have exploded across southern English meadows every summer had largely disappeared from the landscape. What makes this especially striking is that Knepp was not some isolated disaster. By the year 2000, this had become the normal condition of huge areas of English farmland. Now, here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. The behavior of Exmoor ponies ended up changing everything. Unlike sheep, Exmoor ponies do not graze evenly across the land, and that difference turned out to be incredibly important. Sheep tend to move through a field like living lawnmowers, trimming vegetation down to nearly the same height everywhere they go. The result is a clean, tidy-looking landscape with very little variation. Farmers often prefer this because it is easy to manage and highly predictable. But nature thrives on irregularity, not uniformity. Most wildlife species rely on a mixture of habitats existing side by side. They need patches of long grass beside shorter grass, dense shelter near open feeding areas, and exposed soil next to thick vegetation. Exmoor ponies behave very differently. They graze selectively, choosing plants based on texture, taste, season, and instinct. During the warmer months, they focus on softer grasses. When winter arrives, they begin eating rougher and tougher vegetation, including gorse, brambles, and thistles. These are plants that many other grazing animals avoid completely. Because the ponies roam according to their own natural behavior, instead of following a tightly controlled farming system, they create a landscape that may appear messy or chaotic from above, yet at ground level becomes astonishingly diverse and full of life. In some areas, dense walls of blackthorn and hawthorn began taking over. At first glance, the landscape looked disorganized and unruly. But that tangled, thorny middle ground turned out to be the most important part of the entire system. Ecologists refer to this type of environment as transitional habitat, often called thorn scrub. For much of the 20th century, British conservationists viewed thorn scrub as something undesirable, a temporary, messy stage that needed to be removed. Land managers typically cleared it away in order to create either open pasture or dense woodland. To many people, it was seen as little more than useless overgrowth. What Knepp revealed over the following 2 decades completely overturned that assumption. When Charlie Burrell first introduced the Exmoor ponies onto the estate, his overall strategy was surprisingly simple. The idea was basically this: bring back free-roaming animals, stop spraying chemicals, stop plowing the soil, remove unnecessary barriers, and then step back to see how nature responded on its own. What he did not anticipate was the backlash that came almost immediately. Local farmers were outraged. Land that had been carefully managed and neatly cultivated for generations suddenly looked wild and neglected. Fields began filling with ragwort, brambles, and thistles. To many people in the surrounding countryside, it appeared as though the estate was simply being abandoned. The clean, orderly image that traditionally defined good farming in rural England was visibly disappearing, and not everyone was willing to accept that. Fortunately, Natural England, the government agency responsible for nature conservation, continued backing the project despite the pressure. And then, slowly, something extraordinary began happening. Something nobody had planned for, and nobody could have artificially designed. Then came one of the first truly remarkable moments. In 2009, a massive migration of painted lady butterflies was pushed northward from Africa by a powerful high-pressure weather system. Millions of them crossed into Britain, and an astonishing number of those butterflies ended up at Knepp. They were drawn there by huge patches of creeping thistle that had spread across the former farmland. Ironically, those same thistles had become one of the biggest sources of criticism from neighboring farmers, who pointed to them as proof that the estate was being poorly managed. But suddenly, the very plants people were condemning became covered in painted lady butterfly eggs. For Charlie Burrell and Isabella Tree, it became an early sign that the ecosystem they were rebuilding did not operate according to rigid human control or agricultural logic. And then came an even bigger surprise. Nightingales. For decades, nightingales in Britain had been classified primarily as woodland birds. That was where birdwatchers searched for them, where field guides said they belonged, and where conservation efforts focused as their population collapsed. By that point, Britain's nightingale numbers had fallen by more than 90% compared to the 1960s, and most experts believed the decline was linked directly to woodland loss. But by 2010, Knepp was suddenly recording nightingales in numbers that stunned ecologists. Even more surprising was where they were actually living. They were not nesting deep inside forests at all. Instead, the birds were thriving in the dense thorn scrub, tangled bramble patches, and blackthorn thickets created by the uneven grazing patterns of the Exmoor ponies and longhorn cattle. The animals naturally shaped the edges of the scrubland rather than destroying it completely, creating exactly the kind of habitat the birds seemed to prefer. At one point, Isabella Tree asked an ecologist how this was possible. The answer completely changed the way she thought about the entire project. Maybe nightingales had only been labeled as woodland birds, the ecologist suggested, because woodland was simply the last remaining habitat they had left. The nightingale had never truly abandoned thorn scrub in the first place. Once the scrub returned at Knepp, the nightingales immediately returned with it, almost as if they had been waiting for their original habitat to exist again. That discovery raised a much larger and more unsettling question. If scientists had misunderstood the nightingale's preferred environment because its real habitat had been destroyed, then how many other species had also been misclassified over time? How many animals and plants were now labeled as woodland species, heathland species, or farmland species, only because those were the last surviving environments available to them? And how many of them had been quietly surviving in habitats that were never truly ideal? Over the next 2 decades, the monitoring data collected at Knepp began producing numbers so extraordinary that even researchers who had followed the project from the beginning were stunned. The population of singing male nightingales exploded from just 9 birds in 1999 to 62 by 2025. An increase of more than 500%. This happened while the species was continuing to collapse across the rest of Britain, where national numbers had already fallen by over 90%. Turtle doves showed a similarly dramatic recovery. Across the UK, their population declined by roughly 98% between 1994 and 2024. Yet at Knepp, the number of singing males rose from only 2 birds in 2008 to 22 by 2024. The resurgence extended far beyond birds. Dragonflies and damselflies increased by an astonishing 871% between 2005 and 2025. Common whitethroats surged by more than 2,200%. Lesser whitethroats climbed by 1,000%. Chiffchaff populations rose by 1,150%. Butterfly diversity across sections of the estate doubled within 2 decades. Perhaps most remarkable of all was the return of the purple emperor butterfly, one of Britain's rarest and most elusive insects. Conditions at Knepp became so favorable that the estate eventually supported one of the country's largest breeding populations. In 2025 alone, observers counted 283 individual purple emperors in a single day. And all of this was happening on just 3,500 acres of land in the middle of Sussex, an area that for generations had never been viewed as an important wildlife stronghold. By 2010, less than a decade after the Rewilding project began, Knepp was already supporting around 1% of the entire United Kingdom's nesting nightingale population. Ecologist Fleur de Bie, who helped analyze the estate's 20-year ecological review, described the transformation in biodiversity as enormous, not only in the sheer number of species returning, but also in the dramatic growth of individual populations within those species. According to her, the driving force behind this explosion of life was surprisingly straightforward: the way free-roaming animals completely reshaped the structure of the habitat itself. In the early years, what Knepp lost was traditional farming income. Charlie Burrell never tried to hide that reality. Financially, the estate had already been failing as a conventional farm long before the Rewilding project began. The difference was that, over time, the new system created entirely different sources of revenue, ones that standard agriculture could never realistically provide. Wildlife safari tourism became a major attraction, bringing visitors eager to see free-roaming Exmoor ponies, longhorn cattle, deer, and storks moving across the landscape. At the same time, government agri-environment programs started providing support payments tied to ecological restoration rather than crop production. Instead of rewarding maximum agricultural output, these schemes rewarded measurable environmental recovery. Even the meat from the free-roaming animals became part of the model. Pasture-raised beef and venison from the estate were sold at premium prices because of the animals' natural grazing conditions. Former UK government chief scientific advisor Sir Ian Boyd later pointed out a statistic that puts the entire debate into perspective. The least productive half of Britain's farmland produces only around 20% of the country's food supply. And that is the uncomfortable question Knepp ultimately forces people to confront. What happens if land that performs poorly for industrial farming is no longer pushed to produce marginal crop yields at all? What if some of that land is allowed to recover ecologically instead? That idea is now beginning to spread well beyond a single estate. The Knepp model has directly influenced rewilding efforts across England, Scotland, and Wales. From Yorkshire down to Cornwall, land managers are increasingly reintroducing Exmoor ponies, Tamworth pigs, and longhorn cattle, not as traditional livestock, but as tools for shaping ecosystems. One example is the Boothby Wildland project in Lincolnshire, which began shifting away from arable farming in 2022. Early monitoring there is already showing vegetation changes that closely resemble the first stages observed at Knepp. Isabella Tree has often said that she and Charlie Burrell never expected to witness results of this magnitude. Their original hope was for a small, gradual improvement in the land's condition. Instead, what emerged was a transformation so complete that Knepp is now used by ecologists as a kind of reference point, a benchmark for what southern English lowland landscapes might look like when large animals are allowed to return and shape the environment again. But importantly, the change was never about building a habitat from scratch. The Exmoor ponies didn't design or construct anything intentionally. They simply disrupted the old system. By grazing unevenly, trampling selectively, and creating a constantly shifting mix of open ground, dense scrub, and rough vegetation, they produced a landscape that no human management plan would ever have planned in advance, but which turned out to be incredibly rich in ecological life. In the southern block alone, researchers from Queen Mary University mapped around 96 hectares of newly formed scrub habitat from 2001 to 2019. Biodiversity rebounded dramatically, with 18 species now recorded on the estate, compared to almost none in the earlier farming period. White storks, absent from English estates for over 6 centuries, began nesting there again for the first time since 1416. Beavers, which had been extinct in Sussex for roughly 400 years, returned as well, reshaping waterways by building dams and channels that gradually converted small streams into rich wetland systems. All of this was triggered by a single foundational shift, stopping intensive control of the land and allowing ecological processes to unfold on their own terms. On a summer night at Knepp, the evidence is not something you need to search for. It is something you hear immediately if you stand still long enough. Now they are returning, not because the land was forced into productivity, but because a marginal, unprofitable farm was allowed to step away from that model entirely. A few Exmoor ponies were introduced. The land was left to rewild. And then, just as importantly, humans resisted the urge to constantly intervene. So the question this story leaves behind is simple but uncomfortable. What else might abandoned or failed land still be capable of becoming?